June 22nd, 1944. Belarusian front. 3 years to the day since we crossed into Soviet territory. And now the silence felt wrong. Obergefreiter Klaus Steiner stood in his foxhole near Vitebsk, smoking the last of his tobacco, watching the pre-dawn mist roll across the forests that had swallowed so many of his comrades. The air tasted different that morning, metallic, heavy, like the moment before a summer thunderstorm breaks. He had been on the Eastern Front since 1941, survived the hell of Moscow's winter, the grinding battles at Rzhev, and the bloody summer of 43 at Kursk. Steiner knew when something was coming. Behind him, Gefreiter Werner Koch was writing another letter to his wife in Hamburg, the same letter he wrote every week but never sent. Always starting with "My dearest Steiner, when this war is over." The other men of their platoon, what remained of the 2nd Company, 197th Infantry Regiment, were scattered in defensive positions along a line that stretched impossibly thin across the swamps and forest. As for Belorussia, they numbered 23 men now, down from the 140 that had marched into Russia 3 summers ago. Most of the replacements were boys born in 1926, some still growing into their uniforms. Others were Luftwaffe ground crew or rear echelon personnel hastily given rifles and told they were now infantry. Steiner crushed out his cigarette and checked his Kar-9 8K rifle for the 100th time that morning. The weapon was older than some of the men in his squad, but it was reliable. And reliability meant everything when you were 500 kilometers behind what used to be the front line. To his left, positioned in a shallow trench reinforced with logs, sat an MG for a 2 machine gun manned by the Bem brothers from Saxony. Identical twins who had somehow managed to stay together throughout the entire war. They had painted small kill marks on the gun's receiver, over 300 now, though nobody knew if they were counting individual soldiers or just firing sessions. The defenses here were pathetic compared to what they had built during the previous winter. A few trenches, some barbed wire, scattered minefields that the partisans had probably already mapped. The heavy weapons were gone, pulled back to other sectors deemed more critical. The artillery support was minimal. Just a few 105mm guns positioned kilometers behind them with barely enough shells to last a day of serious fighting. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Soviet skies, was now a ghost, a memory. Steiner hadn't seen a German aircraft in weeks, but Soviet fighters roamed freely, their red stars clearly visible as they hunted for targets of opportunity. Most disturbing was the silence from across no man's land for the past 10 days. The usual Soviet probing attacks had stopped, the sporadic artillery fire that had become as routine as breakfast had ceased. The partisans who normally harassed their supply lines had vanished into the forests. It reminded Steiner of June 1941, but in reverse, the calm before annihilation. He had tried to warn Hauptmann Richter, their company commander, but the captain had dismissed his concerns with the tired refrain that High Command knew what they were doing, that the Soviets were exhausted, that this was merely a temporary lull before the summer mud season began. But Steiner had seen the intelligence reports that filtered down, the reconnaissance flights that showed massive Soviet troop concentrations, the deserters who spoke of entire armies massing for something big. As the first light of dawn began to penetrate the mist, Steiner looked at the faces of the men round him, some sleeping, some staring into nothing, some praying quietly. He wondered how many would still be alive by nightfall. Gefreiter Koch folded his letter carefully and tucked it into his tunic pocket, then picked up his Sturmgewehr 44, one of the few modern weapons their company possessed. The morning birds began their songs, and for a moment, everything seemed almost peaceful, almost normal, as if this strip of Russian earth wasn't about to become the grave of an entire German army group. Then, At precisely 00 hours, the eastern horizon erupted in a wall of flame that turned night into day, and the earth began to shake. The bombardment that morning exceeded anything we had experienced. Even those of us who had survived Stalingrad or the hell of the meat grinder. Over 400,000 shells fell on our positions in the first 4 hours alone. A concentration of firepower that the Red Army had learned from studying our own blitzkrieg tactics, and then perfected with American industrial might behind them. Steiner pressed himself into the bottom of his foxhole as the world disintegrated round him. The sound was beyond description, not individual explosions, but a continuous roar that seemed to come from the earth itself, a mechanical thunder that shook the fillings loose from your teeth and made your organs vibrate inside your chest. The carefully prepared defensive positions, weak as they were, simply ceased to exist. Trenches collapsed, burying men alive. Communication lines were severed in the first minutes. The few bunkers that had been constructed took direct hits from 203mm howitzers, heavy guns that the Soviets were now deploying in numbers that seemed impossible. Steiner survived because his foxhole was slightly off the main line, positioned near a massive oak tree that somehow remained standing while everything round it was shredded. Through the smoke and dirt, he caught glimpses of the Bem brothers' machine gun position taking a direct hit one moment they were there. The next there was only a crater and scattered equipment. Werner Koch was screaming something, but no sound could penetrate the breach. A young replacement, a boy named Muller who had arrived just 3 days ago from Hitler Youth training, was crying and calling for his mother, his hands pressed over his ears, his entire body shaking. The shells kept falling, high explosive, fragmentation, incendiary. Some new type that created a vacuum, and then an enormous pressure wave that killed men without, leaving a mark on them. The Soviet artillery crews worked with mechanical precision, walking their fire back and forth across the German lines, ensuring that any position that survived the first wave would be caught in the second or third. After 2 hours, the forest that had provided concealment for their positions was gone, replaced by a lunar landscape of overlapping craters and splintered wood. The carefully camouflaged defensive line was now completely exposed, every position visible to Soviet observers. Then came the aircraft. Steiner heard them before he saw them, a deep rumble that grew into a roar as wave after wave of Sturmovik ground attack planes swept over the shattered German lines. These were not the outdated biplanes they had faced in 1941, but modern armored aircraft that could absorb punishment and deliver devastating firepower. The Il-2 South came in low, their 23mm cannons ripping through anything that moved, their rockets turning the few remaining strong points into funeral pyres. Behind them came the bombers, P-2 South and American-made E-20 Bostons, dropping their payloads with precision on predetermined targets, command posts, artillery positions, supply depots. The Luftwaffe response was non-existent. Steiner watched helplessly as a convoy of supply trucks, attempting to reach their position, was caught in the open and systematically destroyed, each vehicle exploding in sequence as the Soviet pilots worked their way down the column. When the artillery barrage finally lifted at 08:00 hours, Steiner cautiously raised his head and immediately wished he hadn't. The world had changed. Where there had been forest, there were now only stumps and burning timber. Where there had been defensive positions, there were only craters. Where there had been men, there were only pieces of his platoon of 23. He could see perhaps 7 or 8 figures moving in the devastation. Hauptmann Richter was dead. His command post had taken a direct hit. The company's senior NCO, Feldwebel Cross, was attempting to rally survivors, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, blood soaking through his tunic. Then Steiner saw them emerging from the smoke and dust like figures from a nightmare. Tanks. Not a few tanks, not a company or even a battalion, but hundreds of them, T-34s advancing in waves, their broad tracks churning up the shattered earth, infantry clinging to their hulls. Behind the first wave came more tanks, and behind those, more still, a steel avalanche that seemed to have no end. The Soviet 1st Baltic Front and 3rd Belarusian Front had committed everything to this assault over for 1,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, supported by 2.5 million men. This was Operation Bagration, named after the Russian general who had fought Napoleon. And its objective was simple: the complete destruction of German Army Group Center. Steiner grabbed his Panzerfaust, one of the few anti-tank weapons their position still possessed, and ran toward what remained of the defensive line. Round him, the survivors were doing the same, driven by training, by duty, by the simple instinct to fight back against overwhelming odds. The MG-40 that had replaced the Bem brothers' destroyed weapon opened fire, its distinctive buzz saw sound cutting through the chaos. Gefreiter Koch appeared at Steiner's side, his Sturmgewehr 44 already chattering as he engaged Soviet infantry. The first T-34 exploded as someone Steiner never learned who managed to hit it with a Panzerschreck. But for every tank destroyed, 5 more appeared. The Soviet tactics had evolved from the crude frontal assaults of 1941. Now they moved with coordination, infantry and armor working together, suppressing German positions with overwhelming firepower before bypassing strong points to drive deep into the rear areas. Within 3 hours of the barrage lifting, Soviet forces had penetrated 15 kilometers into the German lines. By noon, entire regiments had been cut off and sounded. The radio, when it worked at all, brought only fragmentary reports of disaster Vitebsk encircled, Orsha falling, Mogilev under assault, Army Group Center, which had stood as an apparently immovable barrier for 3 years, was disintegrating. Stein looked at the men round him, at Werner Koch with his modern assault rifle that would make no difference, at young Muller who had stopped crying and now fought with the desperate energy of someone who knew death was coming, at Feldwebel Cross who continued to give orders despite his wound. They were still fighting, still holding their impossible positions, but every man there knew the truth that was becoming undeniable with each passing hour. The Wehrmacht was being crushed. And this time there would be no miracle recovery, no brilliant counterattack, no strategic withdrawal to prepared positions. This time, the Red Army would not stop until it reached Berlin. By the afternoon of June 23rd, the defensive line that had existed on paper in the operations rooms of Army Group Center headquarters simply no longer existed in reality. Steiner and the survivors of his company, now numbering less than 40 men cobbled together from various units, found themselves fighting not along a continuous front, but as an isolated island surrounded by Soviet forces that flowed past them like water round a rock. The orders from higher command, when they came at all through the sporadic radio contact, were contradictory and divorced from reality. Hold until reinforcements arrive established defensive positions. Withdraw to rallying point Dora, but the reinforcements never came. The defensive positions were overrun before they could be prepared, and rallying point Dora had fallen to Soviet tanks 6 hours earlier. Feldwebel Cross had taken command of their mixed group. His wounded arm now roughly bandaged, but still useless. He gathered the senior men Steiner, Koch, and Unteroffizier Hartmann from a pioneer unit round a mud-stained map that was already outdated. "The situation is clear," Cross said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "We are cut off. The Soviets have broken through on both flanks. Vitebsk is surrounded. Probably the 53rd Corps with it. That's 3 divisions, maybe 35,000 men." He traced his finger across the map. "Our only chance is to break out westward before the encirclement is complete. Try to reach the Berezina River." "How far?" Hartmann asked. 80 kilometers, maybe more, Cross replied. Through Soviet-occupied territory, across swamps, with no supplies, no heavy weapons, and the Red Air Force controlling the skies. He looked at each of them. The alternative is to wait here and be captured or killed when the next wave comes through. The men understood what capture meant. They had all heard the stories, seen the evidence themselves. The Soviet treatment of German prisoners had hardened considerably since the early days of the war, especially after the Red Army had liberated the concentration camps and seen what had been done in the occupied territories. The propaganda leaflets that Soviet planes dropped spoke of vengeance, of justice, of making the fascist invaders pay for every village burned, every civilian murdered. At 1600 hours, they began moving west, staying off the roads, using the forests and swamps for concealment. The group had organized itself into a rough formation, scouts ahead, the wounded in the middle on a captured Soviet pony cart, the few remaining machine guns at the rear. They had ammunition for perhaps one serious firefight, rations for 2 days if they were careful, and no medical supplies beyond the basic first aid kits. The summer heat was oppressive, made worse by the smoke from 1,000 fires that hung in the air like fog. Within the first hour, they encountered evidence of the catastrophe that had befallen army groups and abandoned vehicles, some still smoldering, discarded equipment, hastily dug graves, and worse. Near a crossroads, they found the remains of a supply column that had been caught by Soviet aircraft. The trucks burned out, the bodies of the drivers still in their seats, charred beyond recognition. Young Muller vomited at the sight, but Steiner noticed the boy no longer cried. They salvaged what they could: a case of stick grenades, some canned rations, a few belts of machine gun ammunition. As darkness fell, they heard the sounds of battle all round them: the crump of artillery, the rattle of machine guns, the screams of men and horses. The night sky glowed orange in multiple directions, entire supply dumps and villages burning. Soviet flares hung in the sky like artificial stars, illuminating vast areas of the countryside as their forces continued their advance even in darkness. This was another change from 1941. The Red Army no longer stopped at night, no longer gave the Germans time to regroup and reorganize. They maintained relentless pressure, 24 hours a day, never allowing their enemy a moment's respite. Round midnight, they had their first close encounter with Soviet forces. The scouts signaled danger, and the column froze in place beside a tree line. Through the darkness, Steiner could hear them: a Soviet mechanized column moving along a parallel road, the grinding of tank treads, the rough voices of the infantry riding on the vehicles. Someone singing a folk song. The column seemed endless. Taking over an hour to pass, Steiner counted at least 40 tanks and twice as many trucks loaded with troops. This was just one small part of the massive Soviet offensive, yet it represented more armor and men than their entire division could now muster. When the sounds finally faded, Cross led them forward again. They crossed the road where the Soviet column had passed, the earth churned to mud by the heavy vehicles, the smell of diesel fuel heavy in the air. On the far side, they entered a village that had been German-occupied just that morning. It was deserted now, the inhabitants fled or hiding. In one house, they found a meal still on the table, the food cold but untouched. The men fell on it ravenously, their first real food in over 24 hours. Steiner stood guard at the window while the others ate. He watched the road, watched the tree line, watched for any movement that might betray approaching danger. His hands shook slightly, not from fear but from exhaustion. He had been awake for nearly 40 hours, his body running on adrenaline and the survival instinct that had kept him alive through 3 years of this war. Werner Koch joined him at the window, chewing on a piece of black bread. "You think we'll make it?" Klaus. Steiner didn't answer immediately. Through the window, he could see more fires on the horizon, could hear the distant rumble of artillery. Some of us, he finally said. Not all of us, but some. Cook nodded and took another bite of bread. That's better odds than we had this morning. At 030 hours, they moved out again. Behind them, the village began to burn, whether set alight by retreating Germans, advancing Soviets, or partisans taking advantage of the chaos. No one knew. Ahead lay 70 more kilometers of enemy-occupied territory, and with each kilometer, the encirclement grew tighter. Army Group Center was being systematically destroyed, its divisions cut off and surrounded in packets. Vitebsk, Orsha, Bobruisk, Minsk. Over 300,000 German soldiers were about to be trapped. And High Command in Berlin, still clinging to Hitler's insane orders that fortified places must be held at all costs, was doing nothing to save them. Steiner and his group were just one small fragment of a shattered army, trying to survive in a catastrophe that would prove to be Germany's greatest military defeat, even worse than Stalingrad. The weight of that knowledge settled on every man as they trudged through the darkness. But still they moved forward, because moving forward was the only choice they had left. The roads were scenes of absolute chaos, rivers of humanity and machinery flowing westward in panic. By the morning of June 24th, when Steiner's group attempted to cross the main highway leading toward Minsk, they witnessed firsthand the complete collapse of military order that had once been the pride of the Wehrmacht. Thousands of soldiers, no longer organized into units, but simply fleeing as individuals or small groups, clogged the roads. Horse-drawn artillery pieces mixed with staff cars, ammunition trucks tried to push past hospital wagons loaded with wounded men whose screams could be heard over the sound of engines and hooves. Feldwebel-Cross had ordered the group to stay off the main roads, correctly assessing that the highways would be death traps, but they needed to cross this one to continue their westward movement. What they saw from the tree line made several of the younger soldiers physically ill. A Stuka dive bomber, its black crosses still visible, lay crumpled in a ditch, the pilot's body still in the cockpit. Further down, a column of trucks had been caught by Soviet aircraft. The vehicles burned out, their cargo of supplies and ammunition scattered across the road. Bodies of the drivers and passengers lying where they had fallen trying to run. But worse than the dead were the living. Officers who should have been organizing defensive positions or orderly withdrawals instead sat dazed in ditches, their command authority evaporated. Nearby, a group of soldiers had broken into a supply truck and were fighting over cases of schnapps, completely oblivious to the danger around them. The military police, the Feldgendarmerie, who normally maintained strict order and whose authority was backed by summary execution powers, were nowhere to be seen. Either dead, fled, or overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the disaster. Some units still maintained discipline. Steiner observed a battery of 88mm guns being towed westward by their crews, the men moving with purpose, their weapons still intact. A company of Panzer grenadiers marched past in formation, their faces grim, but their organization intact, an NCO calling cadence as if this were a training exercise in Bavaria rather than a catastrophic retreat. These islands of discipline stood out starkly against the sea of chaos around them. As they waited for a gap in the traffic to cross, Soviet aircraft appeared, not the heavy bombers, but nimble fighters that came in low, their cannons and machine guns tearing into the packed road. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. Horses screamed and bolted, overturning wagons. Vehicles swerved and crashed into each other. Men scattered in all directions, many running directly into the line of fire. Steiner and his group pressed themselves into the earth as the fighters made multiple passes, the pilots clearly visible in their cockpits as they methodically worked over the target-rich environment. When the aircraft finally departed, the road was a slaughterhouse. Hundreds of new bodies lay among the wreckage, the wounded crying for help that would not come. Fires burned everywhere, ammunition from destroyed trucks cooking off in sporadic explosions. And still, somehow, the column continued moving westward, the survivors simply stepping over the dead and continuing their flight. We cross now, cross-ordered, during the confusion before they reorganize. The group sprinted across the highway, weaving between burning vehicles and panicked horses. Young Muller paused to help a wounded officer, but Steiner grabbed him roughly. He's dead already, just doesn't know it yet. Keep moving. On the far side of the road, they entered a stretch of marshland, the type of terrain that had swallowed entire divisions during previous campaigns. The going was slow, the ground treacherous, but at least they were away from the roads and the killing zones. Here in the swamps, the sound of the disaster faded somewhat, replaced by the buzz of mosquitoes and the croaking of frogs. As if nature itself was indifferent to the human catastrophe unfolding round it. They moved in single file, following Under-Officer Hartmann, who had some experience with pioneer work and could identify the firmest ground. The water rose to their knees, sometimes their waists. Equipment became waterlogged and heavy. Several men developed severe blisters and foot rot from the constant wetness, but there was no time to stop and treat such minor afflictions when capture or death lurked behind every tree line. Late that afternoon, they encountered another group of German soldiers, perhaps 60 men from various units, led by an Oberleutnant named Fischer, who had lost his entire company in the initial bombardment. Fischer's group had more wounded and fewer weapons than Krauss's, but they had something valuable, a radio that still functioned sporadically. The two groups combined, bringing their total strength to just under 100 men. And Fischer, being the senior officer, assumed nominal command, though he wisely deferred to Cross on tactical matters. That evening, as they sheltered in an abandoned farmstead, they managed to raise Army Group headquarters on the radio. The transmission was broken and hard to understand, but the message that came through was clear enough: hold current positions, reinforcements are being organized. Führer has ordered all units to stand fast. The men listened in stunned silence. Hold what positions? Reinforcements from where? They were 80 kilometers behind Soviet lines, cut off, surrounded, with no ammunition, no food, and no hope of relief. Fischer looked at the radio as if it had betrayed him personally. Cross simply shook his head and walked away. That night, round a small fire hidden in the cellar of the farmhouse, the senior men held a quiet conference. "We're not holding anything," Cross said flatly. "We continue west. Anyone who wants to stay and wait for reinforcements is welcome to do so." No one volunteered to stay. Fischer, to his credit, made no objection. The orders from headquarters, we all understand, came from men who have no idea what is actually happening here. He pulled out his map. The Berezina River is still our objective. If we can reach it, if the bridges are still standing, we might make it to German lines. A big if, Koch muttered. Many ifs, Fischer agreed. But it's the only chance we have. As the men tried to sleep, Steiner lay awake listening to the sounds of battle that continued unabated in every direction. Somewhere out there, in pockets scattered across hundreds of square kilometers, tens of thousands of German soldiers were fighting, dying, or surrendering. The fortress cities that Hitler had ordered held at all costs Vitebsk, Orsha, Bobrusk were being systematically reduced. Their garrisons destroyed or captured. The roads west were clogged with refugees and retreating soldiers. The Soviet juggernaut rolled forward, its momentum unstoppable. Steiner thought about the early days, about June 1941, when they had crossed into Soviet territory with such confidence, such certainty of victory. They had destroyed entire Soviet armies in the first weeks, captured millions of prisoners, raced toward Moscow believing the war would be over by Christmas. Now, 3 years later, it was the Wehrmacht's turn to experience what they had inflicted on others: the chaos of encirclement, the desperation of retreat. The knowledge that the war was lost, but the fighting would continue because there was no other choice. Tomorrow they would move again, would continue their flight westward through enemy territory, would try to survive one more day in a catastrophe that was consuming an entire army group. And through it all, the order from Berlin remained unchanged: stand fast, hold your positions. The Führer commands it. But the men in the field knew better. They understood that following such orders meant death or captivity. And so they did what soldiers have always done. When abandoned by their leadership, they took matters into their own hands and tried to save themselves. June 26th brought a new horror. The encirclement was complete. Steiner's combined group, now numbering 87 men after a skirmish with Soviet reconnaissance troops, had cost them 13 killed and wounded, found themselves in a steadily contracting pocket near the town of Seno. Soviet forces had closed the gap behind them, cutting off any hope of a straightforward retreat westward. They were trapped, along with thousands of other German soldiers, in a killing zone that grew smaller with each passing hour. The reality of their situation became apparent when they reached a hilltop that provided a view of the surrounding countryside. In every direction, Steiner could see Soviet forces, tank columns on the roads, infantry moving through the fields, artillery positions being established on the high ground. The Red Army was methodically tightening the noose, and there was no longer any question of simply walking through their lines. Oberleutnant Fischer gathered the group in a small wooded area that offered some concealment from aircraft. His face was haggard, his uniform torn and filthy. But he still maintained the bearing of an officer. Gentlemen, our situation is grave. We are encircled. The roads west are blocked. Soviet forces are between us and friendly lines. He paused, looking at each man. We have 3 options. First, we can surrender. Some of the younger soldiers shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. Fischer continued. Second, we can hide here and hope the front moves past us, then try to make our way back to German lines later. Or third, we can attempt to break through the encirclement. What are our chances of breaking through? Cross asked. Fischer glanced at Hartmann, who had been studying the terrain and Soviet positions through binoculars. Unteroffizier Hartmann responded, his voice matter of fact. Not good. The Soviets have at least 2 mechanized divisions in our immediate area. Probably more. They control all the main roads and the river crossings. Any breakthrough attempt would have to go through swampland and forests, at night, with no artillery support and limited ammunition. He lowered the binoculars. Maybe 1 man in 5 makes it. Maybe. And surrender. One of the younger soldiers asked quietly, what happens if we surrender? The silence that followed was answer enough. Everyone had heard the stories, seen the evidence. The partisan war in the occupied territories had been brutal on both sides, and the Red Army soldiers liberating their homeland had found villages where every inhabitant had been murdered, had seen the aftermath of encirclement actions, had witnessed the systematic cruelty of the occupation. Soviet treatment of German prisoners had become correspondingly harsh. Some prisoners were shot immediately. Others were marched east to camps in Siberia where survival rates were abysmal. The official Soviet policy was that German soldiers would be used as forced labor to rebuild what they had destroyed, but the reality was often much worse. "We break through," Fischer said finally. "Tonight, we move in small groups, no more than 10 men each. Travel light. Leave the wounded who cannot walk," he paused. The words clearly painful. "We give them morphine and move on. Each group takes a different route. Anyone who makes it to the Berezina rallies at Borisov, if it's still in our hands." The cruelty of the decision hung in the air like the smoke from distant fires. They would be abandoning their wounded comrades, leaving them to die or be captured. But carrying them would doom everyone. This was the mathematics of survival in a catastrophe. Calculations that no training manual covered, but that every veteran understood instinctively. Steiner found himself in a group with Werner Koch, young Muller who had aged years in just days, and 7 other soldiers from various units. Feld Webel cross-led their group. His wounded are now badly infected, but still functional enough. They spent the day preparing checking weapons, dividing the meager remaining ammunition, filling canteens from a nearby stream. Trying to rest, all the rest was impossible with Soviet patrols constantly probing the area. As darkness fell on June 26th, the groups dispersed into the forest, each taking a different bearing westward. Steiner's group moved in single file, maintaining absolute silence, communicating only through hand signals. The night was overcast, which helped conceal their movement, but also made navigation difficult. Cross led them using a compass and an intimate knowledge of terrain reading that came from years of combat experience. They moved slowly, pausing frequently to listen, avoiding open areas, skirting round Soviet positions that they could hear but not see in the darkness round midnight. They heard voices ahead Russian, speaking casually. The sound of men who felt secure because they believed they controlled the area. Cross-signal. Halt, and the group melted into the undergrowth. Through the trees, Steiner could make out a Soviet supply dump. Perhaps 20 trucks parked in a clearing. Sentries posted, but clearly relaxed. This was the rear area for the Red Army. Their lines of communication and supply and security was minimal because German forces were supposed to be surrounded and contained. Elsewhere, for 30 minutes, they lay motionless as Soviet soldiers moved about the camp, unloading supplies, laughing, smoking. One sentry passed within 5 meters of Steiner's position, but never saw him. Finally, the activity died down. Guards were posted, and most of the Soviet soldiers settled in for the night. Cross signaled to move, and the group began crawling past the camp. So close they could smell the Soviet soldiers' tobacco and hear their snoring. It took over an hour to cover 200 meters, every movement careful and deliberate, every breath controlled. Muller's boot knocked against a branch, the sound sharp in the quiet night. And everyone froze. A Soviet sentry called out a challenge in Russian. Silence. The sentry called. Again, more insistent now. Steiner's hand tightened on his Kar-9 8K rifle, his finger on the trigger. If shooting started, they would kill a few Soviets, but then be overwhelmed by superior numbers. Long seconds passed. Finally, the sentry muttered something in Russian and returned to his patrol route. The group remained frozen for another 10 minutes before cross-signaled to continue. They cleared the Soviet compound, moved deeper into the forest. By dawn on June 27th, they had covered perhaps 10 kilometers, moving through territory that was nominally Soviet-controlled but still largely empty of actual troops as the sun rose. They found shelter in a dense thicket beside a swamp and collapsed in exhaustion. They had been moving or fighting for over 72 hours with almost no sleep, minimal food, and constant stress. Men fell asleep instantly, despite the mosquitoes, despite the wet ground, despite the danger. Cross-posted to sentries on rotation and allowed the rest to sleep. Steiner took the first watch with Coke. They sat back to back, weapons ready. Watching the approaches to their hiding spot, neither spoke. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said or that needed saying. The sounds of war continued round them, distant explosions, the grinding of tank treads on a road somewhere to the north, the occasional rattle of machine gun fire. The Red Army was still hunting the scattered remnants of Army Group Center, still tightening the multiple encirclements, still processing thousands of prisoners who had given up hope. That afternoon, they heard something that made every man instantly alert. German voices, calling out in distress. Steiner carefully moved to the edge of their position and observed a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A column of perhaps 200 German prisoners was being marched eastward under Soviet guard, and these were not the defiant, disciplined prisoners of war that early newsreels had shown. These were broken men, many wounded, all exhausted, stumbling along under the rifle butts and shouts of their captors as Steiner watched. One prisoner collapsed and could not rise. A Soviet guard shouted at him, kicked him, and when the man still did not move, shot him casually and moved on. The column continued past, and Steiner counted 3 more men shot for being unable to keep pace. When they were gone, Cross whispered, "That's what waits for anyone who surrenders. We keep moving tonight." The catastrophe unfolding in Belorussia was not the result of Soviet superiority alone, though their forces were formidable and their execution of Operation Bagration nearly flawless. The destruction of Army Group Center was in large measure a consequence of decisions made hundreds of kilometers away in the force headquarters, decisions made by men who refused to acknowledge reality and who valued ideology over the lives of the soldiers entrusted to their command. Steiner and his group, as they continued their desperate flight westward, had no way of knowing the full scope of the disaster or understanding the command failures that had doomed them. But they felt the consequences with every step. The doctrine of fortified places, Hitler's obsession with holding ground at all costs, had been the primary factor in the catastrophe. When Soviet forces had begun their offensive on June 23rd, the logical response would have been to conduct a fighting withdrawal to prepare defensive positions, to trade space for time while preserving forces. This was basic military doctrine, taught in every war college, practiced by competent commanders throughout history. But Hitler had explicitly forbidden such withdrawals. His order was clear. Designated cities and strong points would be declared fortified places and held to the last man. Vitebsk, Orsha, Bobruisk, and Mogilev were designated as fortresses, and entire divisions were locked into these positions with orders not to retreat under any circumstances. The result was predictable to anyone with basic military training. These fortresses were quickly surrounded and their garrisons destroyed or captured. At Vitebsk alone, over 35,000 men of the 53rd Corps were encircled and eventually destroyed, a loss greater than an entire army in previous wars. At Bobruisk, another 40,000 men met the same fate. These were not glorious last stands that bought time for other forces to escape. They were pointless sacrifices that achieved nothing except to inflate Soviet prisoner counts. The commanders in the field had known this would happen, had pleaded with High Command to authorize withdrawals while there was still time, but their requests were denied. General Busch, commander of Army Group Center, was a loyal National Socialist who followed Hitler's orders without question, even when those orders defied military logic. His chief of staff and other senior officers who suggested flexibility in defensive operations were overruled or removed. By the time authorization for withdrawal finally came, it was too late. The Soviet pincers had already closed. The second major failure was the complete miscalculation of Soviet intentions and capabilities. German intelligence had detected the massive Soviet build-up opposite Army Group Center, but had convinced themselves it was a deception, that the real attack would come farther south against Army Group North Ukraine, where the terrain was better for armored operations. This fundamental intelligence failure meant that Army Group Center faced the Soviet onslaught with inadequate reserves, depleted divisions, and no prepared fallback positions. The divisions holding the line in Belorussia were shadows of their former strength. Units that had once numbered 15,000 men now counted 5,000 or fewer. The artillery support was minimal, ammunition stocks were low, and the promised reinforcements never materialized because they were being held in reserve elsewhere, waiting for an attack that would never come. When Operation Bagration struck, these weakened divisions simply disintegrated under the hammer blow. The third failure was the complete absence of mobile reserves capable of conducting effective counterattacks. The Panzer divisions that had once been the Wehrmacht's decisive weapon were either worn down to company strength, withdrawn to other theaters, or held so far in the rear that they could not influence the battle. When Soviet tank columns broke through the thin German defenses, there was nothing to stop them, no armored fist to strike back and seal the breach. The Red Army exploited these gaps ruthlessly, their mechanized forces racing deep into the German rear, cutting supply lines, overrunning headquarters, and creating the chaos that Stein and thousands like him were now experiencing firsthand. For the soldiers in the field, these command failures translated into a daily struggle for survival against impossible odds. On the night of June 28th, Cross-S Group attempted to cross a major road that intelligence suggested led to Borisov and the Belorussian river crossings. What they found instead was a Soviet armor column, over 50 tanks and their supporting vehicles, stopped for refueling and maintenance. The tanks were not the outdated T-34s of 1941, but newer models, many of them American-made Shermans provided through Lend-Lease, their white stars painted over with red stars. The sight of American equipment being used to destroy German forces was particularly galling to the veterans who had been told that the United States was too decadent and weak to wage effective war. The group had to detour south, adding another 10 kilometers to their journey, and as they moved through the darkness they could hear more Soviet columns on parallel roads. The scale of the Soviet offensive was becoming apparent. This was not a local attack or even an army-level operation, but a strategic offensive involving multiple fronts and aimed at the complete destruction of Army Group Center. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers were engaged in the operation, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, and they were advancing on a front hundreds of kilometers wide. Against this onslaught, the scattered remnants of German units could do nothing except try to survive. By June 29th, Krause's group had been reduced to 6 men. Unteroffizier Hartmann had stepped on a mine while crossing a field, dying instantly. 3 others had been separated during a running firefight with Soviet scouts. Young Muller had developed severe dysentery from drinking contaminated water and could barely walk. Werner Koch carried the boy's rifle along with his own, and Steiner supported Muller physically, half carrying him as they moved. The remaining rations were exhausted, and they survived on whatever they could scavenge: raw potatoes from fields, water from streams, once a chicken that had somehow survived the devastation. The radio had been abandoned days ago, the batteries dead and the equipment too heavy to carry. They had no contact with German forces, no knowledge of where friendly lines might be, no information beyond what they could observe directly. They were completely isolated, moving by compass, bearing, and instinct, hoping that if they continued west they would eventually reach safety. On the evening of June 29th, they reached a hilltop that provided a clear view to the west, and what they saw destroyed their last hopes. The Berezina River, their objective, was visible in the distance, and beyond it they could see fires burning, German supply dumps being destroyed, bridges being blown. The unmistakable signs of a general retreat. Even if they reached the river, there was no guarantee the bridges would still be standing or that German forces would still be on the far side. The Red Army had advanced so quickly that they might have already crossed the Berezina themselves. Cross sat heavily on the ground. His infected arm now swollen and red with sepsis, his face grey with pain and exhaustion. 6 days, he said quietly. 6 days ago we were manning defensive positions, complaining about the food, writing letters home. Now look at us. Steiner had no reply. He looked at the small group, Coke, his face thin and haggard, his assault rifle now useless because they had no ammunition for it. Mahler barely conscious, his trousers soiled from his illness. The 2 other survivors, men whose names he barely knew, who had attached themselves to the group because solitary fight meant certain death. This is what defeat looks like, Steiner thought. Not the romantic tragedy of the opera or the noble sacrifice of propaganda films, but this sick, starving men abandoned by their leadership, left to die in a foreign land for a cause that was already lost. That night, as they huddled in a ruined barn, Coke asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. Why did they leave us here? Why didn't High Command order a withdrawal when there was still time? Cross, his fever making him speak more freely than he normally would, replied with unusual bitterness. Because Hitler ordered every position held. Because retreat is forbidden. Because in Berlin, they look at maps with pins and flags and think that makes divisions real. That if the map shows a division at Vitebsk, then 15,000 men must be there, ready to fight. They don't see that the division is actually 3,000 exhausted men with no ammunition facing 30,000 fresh Soviet troops with unlimited artillery support. And when those 3,000 men are destroyed or captured, Berlin simply puts a new pin on the map and declares a new division formed. He coughed, a wet rattling sound. We're not fighting a war anymore. We're refeeding men into a grinder to buy a few more weeks for the Führer's fantasy of final victory. The words hung in the air. Treasonous words that in other circumstances could mean death. But here in the ruins of Army Group Center they were simply the truth that everyone already knew, but rarely spoke aloud. Survival became an hourly calculation, a constant series of decisions about whether to move or hide, whether to risk drinking from a questionable water source or suffer dehydration, whether to help a wounded comrade or leave him behind to improve your own chances. For Steiner and the remaining members of his group, the days blurred together into an endless cycle of movement, fear, exhaustion, and the grinding awareness that each decision might be their last. July 1st found them still east of the Berezina River, moving through terrain that had been fought over repeatedly and now bore the scars of mechanized warfare. Abandoned vehicles littered the roadsides, German trucks and half-tracks that had run out of fuel or broken down, some showing signs of hasty destruction by their crews. Others simply left intact for the Soviets to capture. The fields were cratered from artillery fire, the forests stripped by bombardment, and everywhere were the unburied dead, German and Soviet alike, their bodies bloating in the summer heat. Young Muller had deteriorated further, his dysentery now complicated by fever. He could no longer walk unassisted, and carrying him slowed the group dangerously. On the morning of July 1st, Cross made the decision, and they had all been drilling. "We can't carry him any farther," the Feldwebel said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Every hour we spend moving this slowly is an hour closer to capture." Muller, lying on the ground where they had placed him during a rest halt, looked up at them with eyes that showed he understood. His fever-bright gaze moved from face to face, finally settling on Steiner. "It's all right, Herr Obergefreiter," the boy said, his voice barely a whisper. "You tried. Tell my mother." He paused, struggling for breath. "Tell her I was brave." Steiner knelt beside the dying soldier. This child who had been drafted from Hitler Youth just weeks ago and thrown into hell without adequate training or preparation. "I'll tell her," Steiner lied, knowing he would never meet Muller's mother, that if he survived this war at all it would be a miracle. That the boy's family would receive only a missing-in-action telegram if they received anything. At all. Coke pressed their last morphine threat into Muller's hand. "When the pain gets too bad," he said simply. They left him there, propped against a tree with a canteen of water and the morphine, and moved on. Steiner did not look back, could not look back, because to do so would be to acknowledge the complete moral bankruptcy of what they had become. They were no longer soldiers in any meaningful sense, no longer even human in the way that mattered. They were animals focused solely on survival, capable of abandoning a dying boy without a backward glance. This was what total war had made them. That afternoon they encountered another group of German survivors. -1 men led by a Hauptfeldwebel from a pioneer battalion. The two groups eyed each other warily at first, weapons ready. Because in the chaos of the encirclement discipline had broken down completely and there were reports of desperate men killing other Germa. As for their food or supplies, but recognition of common purpose prevailed, and they joined forces. The Hauptfeldwebel, a career soldier named Brandt who had been in the Wehrmacht since 1935, had better intelligence than they did. "The Berezina bridges are gone," he reported matter-of-factly. "Blown 3 days ago. The Soviets are across the river in force. There's no German line to retreat. To any more, everything east of Minsk is Soviet territory now." "Then where do we go?" Coke asked, his voice edged with desperation. Brandt pulled out a map, its edges torn and stained with mud and blood. "The partisan zones," he said, pointing to the vast forested areas north of their current position. "We hide in the forests, avoid Soviet patrols, and wait for the front to stabilize. Then we try to infiltrate back through the lines. It could take weeks, maybe months, weeks or months behind Soviet lines. In partisan territory where the local population hated Germans with good reason. With no supplies and no support. The alternative, however, was immediate capture or death." The combined group, now 14 men, turned north and headed into the forests that had sheltered partisan bands throughout the German occupation. These were the same forests where Einsatzgruppen had conducted mass executions, where partisan reprisals against collaborators had been equally brutal, where the war had taken on its most savage character. As they entered the deep woods, Steiner felt as if they were descending into a hell more complete than anything they had yet experienced. The forests were dense and primeval, barely touched by modern civilization even before the war. Massive oak and pine trees blocked out the sun, creating a perpetual twilight even at midday. The undergrowth was thick with brambles and nettles that tore at their uniforms and skin. Swarms of mosquitoes and black flies made sleep nearly impossible. Water was abundant but often stagnant and disease-ridden. Food was scarce. They survived on berries, mushrooms that Brandt identified as edible, once a deer that Steiner managed to shoot with his last riff. The cartridge, the sound of the shot echoing through the forest and sending them fleeing for Hausen. Fear that Soviet or partisan patrols would investigate. They moved at night when possible, Hiding during the day in dense thickets or abandoned hunters' shelters, several times they heard voices in the distance Russian, Belorussian. German, but they avoided all contact. Trust had become impossible, even seeing other German. Soldiers was no guarantee of safety because deserters and desperate men were capable of anything. The isolation was profound and psychologically crushing. For weeks they had been part of a military organization, however battered and dysfunctional. Now they were completely alone. Cut off not just from their command structure, but from any human contact beyond their small group. The radio had been silent for days before they abandoned it. No aircraft flew overhead except Soviet fighters and bombers. The war continued around them. They could hear artillery in the distance. Occasionally sea fires on the horizon, but they were no longer participants. Merely survivors hiding in the wilderness. On July 5th, they stumbled upon a partisan camp that had been recently abandoned. Probably within hours, the crude shelters were still standing, fires still smoldering, more ominously. There were signs of German prisoners having been held, their torn uniform fragments. A Wehrmacht identification disc hanging from a tree branch, and in one shelter. Unmistakable bloodstains and evidence of torture. Whatever had happened to those prisoners, Steiner preferred not to imagine. The discovery made them move with even greater caution, posting sentries at all times. Never staying in one location for more than a few hours, the psychological strain was immense. Koch developed a nervous tic, his hands constantly trembling. One of the men from Brandt's group began talking to himself, carrying on conversations with people who weren't there. Another simply sat down one morning and refused to move, staring into space with dead eyes until they were forced to leave him. Krause's infected arm had turned gangrenous, the flesh black and oozing, the smell of rot following them wherever they went. The Feldwebel knew he was dying, but continued to function through sheer willpower and the knowledge that his death would likely doom the remaining men who depended on his leadership and experience. By mid-July, they had been behind Soviet lines for 3 weeks. The group had been reduced to 9 men through death, illness, and desertion. They were unrecognizable as German soldiers. Their uniforms were rags, their boots held together with wire and strips of cloth, their bodies skeletal from starvation. They had not shaved in weeks, had not bathed except in forest streams. They looked like wild men, like prehistoric humans hiding from predators, and in a sense that's exactly what they were. The war had stripped away all pretense of civilization and reduced them to their most basic imperatives: find food, find water, avoid danger, survive another day. We've watched our entire army group destroyed. We've abandoned wounded comrades to die. We've done things that would have been unthinkable a year ago, and you're asking if we're fit for duty. The personnel officer, a Hauptmann who probably had never been closer to the front than Berlin, looked at him with barely concealed contempt. The Reich requires every able-bodied man. You have combat experience, which makes you valuable. You'll be assigned to a Volksgrenadier division forming in Bavaria. Report to the quartermaster for equipment. That evening, as they sat in the replacement barracks waiting for their transport assignment, Koch voiced what they both knew. We're going back, aren't we? Back to the front. Back to another encirclement. Back to another disaster. Steiner nodded slowly. Until we're killed or captured, or the war ends, yes, we're going back. But Koch, here's what I realized out there in the forests. The war is already over. Germany has lost. Everything that happens from now on is just the final act. Men dying for a cause that's already defeated. The tragedy is that it will go on for months. Maybe another year, and hundreds of thousands more will die before the end comes. They sat in silence, two survivors of a catastrophe that had destroyed an entire army group, waiting to be fed back into the machine that would eventually consume them, round them. Other soldiers, some veterans like themselves. Others fresh replacements who had no idea what awaited them, prepared for deployment. The war would continue because the leadership in Berlin could not or would not accept reality, because the military machine had its own momentum that carried everyone forward, regardless of rationality, and because individual soldiers had no choice but to obey orders until death or capture released them. Steiner thought about all the men he had known who were now dead or in Soviet camps: Feldwebel, Cross, Young Muller, the Bem brothers, Hauptmann, Richter, and hundreds of others, whose names he could no longer remember, but whose faces still haunted his dreams. He thought about the 3 years he had spent fighting across Russia, the victories that now meant nothing, the sacrifices that had been wasted by incompetent leadership and criminal ideology. Most of all, he thought about the moment on June 22nd when he had stood in his foxhole near Vitebsk, sensing that something terrible was coming, not knowing that within hours the world he knew would cease to exist, and that he would spend the next 3 months simply trying to survive in the ruins of a shattered army. The Red Army had crushed the Wehrmacht not just through superior numbers or material, though those factors were important, but by exposing the fundamental hollowness at the heart of the German war effort, the refusal to acknowledge reality, the prioritization of ideology over military necessity, the willingness to sacrifice entire armies for political or symbolic objectives. Operation Bagration had been the moment when all these failures converged, when the consequences of years of criminal leadership could no longer be papered over with propaganda or tactical virtuosity. As Steiner finally settled down to sleep that night, his last conscious thought was a simple recognition that would have been treasonous to speak aloud, but that every frontline soldier knew in his heart: Germany had lost the war, and all that remained was to survive until the inevitable end came.